John chapter 21, verses 1 to 14. Afterwards, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee and 2 other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them. And they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat. But that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals, there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153, but even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. Peter sat in his room, his mind going over it again and again. If only he hadn't said those words. If only he'd kept his mouth shut. How many times had his impulsive nature got him into trouble? But this time he'd really done it. "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." What was he thinking? Jesus' reply had cut to the quick. "This very night before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. In his hurt pride, he'd re-emphasised his commitment. "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." Words, just words. But oh, how they came back to haunt him. That night, that awful night, his friend, his teacher in agony and tears, and nothing they could do. Then the soldiers. The swords, his sword swinging against the high priest's servant, and again, words of rebuke. An act of healing in the midst of that darkness. It wasn't his fault, was it? It had all happened so quickly. No time to think, just react. They had to save Jesus, didn't they? So, he had followed, crept in the darkness, keeping out of sight, and somehow had made it to that fire in the courtyard, whilst Jesus, just out of sight, was facing lies and accusations flung at him. And there in that courtyard, more accusations. Just closer this time. "You were with him, weren't you?" Before he realised it, the denial came out. "I never knew him." A defensive response. Again, no time to think. Previous messiahs, well, their followers had been rounded up and, well, you knew what happened. Words. Oh, words. Once they were out. And then what could he do except stick to the line, keep up the lies, till that mournful rooster crowed. And here he was, again and again, round and round those words went in his mind. What could he do? Jesus had said he'd meet them here in Galilee. But Peter wasn't really sure that he wanted to. Well, of course he did. He loved him, and the day he realised that Jesus was alive, that he had risen, was the best day of his life, blown away by the amazement of all. But now, days later, with time to think, all he could do was keep going over and over and over it in his mind. How could he look him in the face after what he'd done? It just wasn't going to be the same. Okay, he thought, I need to snap out of this. I need a distraction. He knew the best thing for him, his safe place, what he felt comfortable with. Let's go fishing. As he walked down to the shore, he passed James and John working out the front of their father's shop. I'm going out to fish, he called. They needed no second asking. Along with Thomas and Nathaniel and a few others, they gathered up the nets and prepared the boat. The same routine Peter had played out week after week. Till that day, 3 years ago. It had all started down here on the shore of the lake. So many good memories. It had been his brother, Andrew, who had introduced him to Jesus. He remembered that day so clearly. Jesus needed a vantage point from which to speak to the crowds, and Andrew had suggested the boat. There wasn't much else for them to do. It had been a pretty rubbish night. Hours of rowing and pulling in the nets, and what to show for it? Not a lot. So they had used the time sorting a few tears in the nets, checking over the boats, making sure everything was fine for the next night's fishing. And as they did so, they listened to this man talk like nothing they had ever heard before. It made so much sense. Why had they not seen it like this before? Peter's arms and neck tingled with excitement. He just knew that this was a moment in history. The time flew, and before he knew it, Jesus had finished and was squatting there in the boat next to him. Put out to deep waters. Let down your nets and for a catch. Well, he had to point it out, really. I mean, they'd been fishing all night long and not caught a thing. And the heat of the day, well, that really wasn't the time to catch fish. But somewhere, deep down, he just knew it was right. Jesus had a presence, an authority like nothing he had ever known. So they did as they were told, launching the boats and dropping the nets. It was amazing. The nets strained as they pulled so many fish on board, and yet the nets did not break. Jesus had turned and looked straight in Peter's eyes, and it felt like he was standing there naked, his soul exposed. He remembered how he had fallen to his knees, so aware of his flawed and broken life. Peter came back from his reminiscence. The boat was loaded and heading out deeper for deeper waters. It was good to be in the company of the other disciples. So many shared experiences over the last 3 years. As the night fell, John manoeuvred the boat to their favourite spot for fish, and they dropped their nets. Memories flooded back of times on the lake together, crossing from side to side with Jesus in the boat. That time when Peter himself had stepped out on the water, holding on to Jesus' hand as he suddenly feared that he might sink beneath the waves. And yet, as his eyes met those loving eyes, he stood there, that miraculous experience. It was a peaceful time, quiet and dark, and sharing stories of Jesus and remembering that roller coaster experience of excitement was so great. They talked of the teaching, that they'd sat and listened, how their ears had burned as he'd explained the scriptures in a way that was just so clear and insightful. But more than that, how something had come in alive inside them as he'd spoken to the crowds. They didn't just understand the scriptures, they experienced it in him. And in more than one way. As they crisscrossed the countrysides with Jesus, they saw things that they would have never believed. The blind were made to see, the lame to walk. Those with that horrible disfiguring disease of leprosy, they were healed. And then there were those who were raised from the dead. Well, Lazarus, that was something else. 3 days in the tomb. And yet the words of Jesus spoken, and he came forward. But most of all, they remembered just sitting, spending time together, time with one another, time away from the crowds, talking, sharing, and being with Jesus. It was hard to explain, but time spent in his presence, well, it was just something else. He knew you, yet he loved you. Not some fluffy emotion, no, deep, patient, understanding love. And boy, did he need to be patient with them. So, they worked away that night, moving the nets, moving the boat, sharing and chatting. As the night progressed, it became clear. The fish had found somewhere else to hide out. They caught nothing. It happened sometimes. As the sun started to rise, they headed back towards the shore. It looked like it was going to be another beautiful day. Along the shore, a smoky haze could be seen, and as the boat moved in that direction, the source of the smoke became clear. A small wood fire, and with someone looking into the flames. As they drew closer, the man stood up, walking to the shore. "Good day fishing, friends. How was the catch?" "Not a great night. I think the fish were off partying elsewhere." "Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." Do you know, I think as he said that, deep down, they realised. They probably just didn't quite take it in. As the net went down, up it came, bursting with fish. That was all it took. "It's the Lord!" And Peter was in the water, wading towards the shore. All thoughts and worries behind him, unable to wait to be with Jesus. On the shore, the fire crackled, and drawing close, the smell of cooked fish drifted across the beach. Jesus walked over. Standing in front of Peter, he placed his hands on his shoulders and looked into his eyes. Peter didn't need to say anything. He knew he was known and loved. "We need some fish, Jesus. More fish," Jesus said. "Bring the net over here. Let's get this breakfast started." So Peter returned to the boat, and hauling the net over, they prepared more fish to add to those already roasting on the fire. The fire crackled as they chatted, passing the time of day, sharing hopes and dreams. It was like old times. And Peter felt, well, what was it that he felt? He felt like he'd come home, where he meant to be. Jesus passed the fish and the bread around, and they shared food and company. Peter thought back to previous meals they'd shared with Jesus. That wedding meal at Cana, and that first amazing miracle of water into wine. Then there were those posh tables and heated discussions with the Pharisees. But the one that really came to mind was sitting outside sharing fish and bread, as they were doing now, that a little boy had selflessly given of his packed lunch, and the fact that that small food had easily fed 5,000 plus people, shared out by Jesus. As Peter looked back and reflected, things never quite went as expected with Jesus. They'd all been ready to give up and go home. Look, we've got no food. We can't feed all these people. They'd been in a bit of a habit of that, looking to give up and go home. They're just about to give up and go home, having caught no fish. But listening to Jesus could change everything. You know, Peter thought he was starting to get it. He'd been so certain, so sure that he knew what Jesus wanted. He knew that he could do it. He could serve Jesus. He'd known he would be a great disciple, following Jesus no matter what. Well, that had gone so well. When all those years ago, Jesus had said that unless you changed and became like a little child, you would never enter the kingdom of heaven, he really hadn't gotten it. What a strange comment. What on earth did a little child have to offer? Nothing, really. Now, he was beginning to see. His problem was he thought that he did have something to offer, that Jesus needed him. That little child was dependent for all that it needed, trusting in its parent to provide all its needs. It was starting to make sense as he looked back. It had been when they were at the end of their resources, when all they could do was trust Jesus, when the nets were all empty. It was then, when they obeyed his instructions to throw in the nets, that things had started to happen. He'd been so anxious, trying so hard, and yet he didn't need to worry. After all, if you wanted to have a relationship with a little child, you had to do all the running. The child just had to show up, be present to you. It was you that brought all the good things to the relationship. And he realised, actually, with Jesus, all he had to do was show up. It was Jesus who brought all the good things to the relationship. All he needed to do was to relax, enjoy the relationship, trusting him and following his lead. And he realised, as he looked in those eyes, that the love that Jesus showed him, the love that he had, was so, so great that he could trust him for everything he needed, that he could live loved in that experience. As he ate and talked and thought, he realised that he wasn't going over his failures again and again now. The fear had gone. Just the look of love that Jesus had given him had melted it away. He was loved, truly loved, and perfect love cast out all fear. But he was still sad to have betrayed his friend. As if he had heard at that moment, Jesus called him to one side. But that is a story for another day.